Vivienne Hart snatched the ribbon right off the festival table before the judge could pin it to the tray. She held it up where everyone could see. That blue satin prize ribbon, the one every baker in Red Hollow had spent 3 weeks working toward. And she smiled the way a cat smiles at something it's already crushed underfoot. "Thank you," she said sweetly, loud enough for the whole crowd to hear. "My peach tart, my recipe, my ribbon." She never looked at her sister. She didn't have to. Mabel Hart stood 8 feet away with flowers still on her wrists and dried peach syrup cracked at the corners of her knuckles, and she didn't say a word. She just watched Vivienne take the one thing she had spent 3 sleepless nights perfecting, and she pressed her lips together the way a woman does when she has swallowed this exact moment so many times it no longer even surprises her. That was the moment everything in Red Hollow changed. Not because Mabel finally fought back. She didn't. Not yet. It changed because the richest man in the territory was standing close enough to see all of it, and he was watching the wrong sister. If you've ever worked twice as hard as everyone around you and still been the one nobody noticed, this story is going to feel like it was written for you. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stories like this one come every week, and you don't want to miss what happens next. Tap the like button if you believe a woman's worth is never determined by what other people failed to see in her. And drop a comment. Tell me your city, your country, wherever in the world you're watching from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to Red Hollow, Texas. 1883. And let's start at the very beginning of the woman nobody chose. The town of Red Hollow had its own particular cruelty, the kind that didn't announce itself with violence or raised voices, but with something quieter and harder to name. The way a room adjusts when certain people walk in, and the way it doesn't when certain others do. Mabel Hart had lived inside that quiet cruelty for most of her 25 years. She was not the kind of woman Red Hollow wrote stories about. She was broad-shouldered and round-faced, with hands that had cracked at the knuckles every winter since she was 14, and calluses that no amount of lard would soften. She moved quickly and without grace, because grace was something you had time to practice when someone else was managing the ovens. Mabel had never had that kind of time. Her parents, Thomas and Ruth Hart, had opened the bakery on Clement Street the year Mabel was born. By the time she was 10, she was measuring flour before school. By 12, she was opening the shop alone while her mother rested. By the time both her parents were gone, her father to a lung sickness in the winter of 1876, her mother 14 months later from grief that wore the shape of fever, Mabel was 19 years old and entirely responsible for a business she had never legally owned and a younger sister who had never once offered to help manage it. Vivienne was 17 when their mother died. Beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful, which is to say completely and without effort, the kind of beautiful that people in small towns mistake for virtue. She had their mother's coloring, pale gold hair and green eyes that caught the light. And she had learned early that her appearance was a form of currency she didn't need to supplement with labor, or patience, or gratitude. Mabel had watched this understanding develop in her sister, the way you watch weather come in from the west. There was a period when it might have gone differently. When Vivienne was 15, she had helped in the bakery 3 mornings in a row after their father's first bad episode, and Mabel had felt something close to hope. Then a boy from the Renner family had come to buy a loaf of bread and told Vivienne she was the prettiest girl in the county, and Vivienne had smiled and untied her apron and handed it back to Mabel without a word, and that had been the end of the experiment. After that, the division of their lives became permanent. Mabel worked. Vivienne was seen. The bakery kept them both fed, both clothed, both housed in the small rooms above the shop on Clement Street. Mabel paid the suppliers and fixed the oven when the flue cracked and renegotiated with the flour merchant every spring, and swept the floor every night and woke at 4 in the morning every day, including Sundays. She did all of this without resentment, or rather without resentment she allowed herself to examine too closely, because examining it would have required her to acknowledge how much of herself she had surrendered to keep a roof over both their heads. What she had surrendered, mostly, was any expectation of being chosen. Not chosen for love specifically, though that too. Chosen for anything. For a conversation, for an opinion, for the kind of attention that implied the other person believed your thoughts were worth waiting for. Red Hollow noticed Vivienne. It tolerated Mabel. This had been true for so long that Mabel had stopped expecting it to change. Then Rhett Calloway rode into town, and everything shifted in ways Mabel did not see coming and would not have predicted if she had. Rhett Calloway was 31, and he had been the subject of conversation in Red Hollow for the better part of 6 months before he actually arrived. The Calloway Ranch sat 14 miles northeast of town, 2,200 acres of well-watered grazing land with a herd that had survived 2 drought years that wiped out smaller operations, and a main house that the banker's wife had described as the finest private residence in 3 counties. Rhett had inherited all of it at 24 when his father died, and had spent the 7 years since then expanding it, improving it, and by all available accounts, running it well. He was also, as far as anyone in Red Hollow could determine, completely unmarried. This had become a matter of near civic interest by the autumn of 1883. Men speculated about it at the feed store. Women discussed it at every social occasion. The general consensus was that Rhett Calloway would need a wife eventually, that he was clearly not opposed to the idea on principle, and that whoever he chose would be very fortunate indeed. Vivienne Hart had been planning for the possibility since May. Mabel had not thought about it once. She was too busy with the railway contract. The regional railway expansion had reached Red Hollow that summer, and the celebration committee had put out a request for bakers willing to supply breads, pies, and pastries for the governor's arrival ceremony in November. It was the largest commercial opportunity the town had seen in years, and Mabel had spent 3 weeks preparing her submission, a detailed menu, price estimates, samples for the committee chairman, and a letter of references from every merchant on Clement Street who had bought her bread for the past 4 years. She had submitted it in September and was waiting for the response. She was also, in the mornings before the shop opened, testing a new recipe. Peach tart with a pressed spice crust she had developed by accident in August, when she mistakenly combined cardamom and dried ginger in a ratio she had never tried before. The result had been startling, warm and complicated and unlike anything she had tasted from another kitchen. She had made it 6 times since then, adjusting each time, and she was beginning to believe it was the best thing she had ever produced. She had not told Vivienne about the recipe. She had learned to keep certain things to herself. Rhett Calloway came into the Hart Bakery for the first time on a Thursday morning in early October, before the sun was fully up, when Mabel was the only one awake and the second batch of bread was still in the oven. He knocked at the back door, which surprised her, because customers came to the front. She opened it with flour on her face and her hair pushed back under a work cloth and her sleeves rolled past the elbows, and she looked at him the way she looked at every unexpected arrival, directly, with mild suspicion and no particular warmth, because warmth at 4:40 in the morning required more energy than she generally had. "We're not open," she said. "I saw the light." "The light is for baking, not for selling." He didn't seem offended. He had an unhurried quality about him, the kind that some men confuse with laziness but isn't, the kind that comes from being comfortable enough in your own circumstances that you don't feel the need to fill every silence with performance. "I've been writing since 2, he said. "I could smell the bread from the road." Mabel studied him for a moment. He was tall, lean through the shoulders, with the look of someone who worked outdoors and had stopped trying to look like he didn't. His coat was good quality but worn. His boots were muddy. He wasn't performing anything, which she noted because most men who came to the back door of a woman's business alone before sunrise were performing something. She stepped back and let him in. She poured him coffee from the pot on the iron stove and cut him a heel of yesterday's sourdough without being asked and set it in front of him at the work table and went back to checking the oven. He ate without commentary, drank the coffee, watched her work. "This is good bread," he said eventually. "I know." He almost smiled. She didn't see it because she was checking the oven door, but it happened. He introduced himself before he left. She already knew who he was. Everyone in Red Hollow knew who he was. But she didn't say so. She gave him her name in return and told him the shop opened at 7 and he was welcome to come back during business hours. He came back the next morning, before 7. She let him in again because the alternative was leaving him standing at the door. And she was practical enough to recognize that a man who rode 14 miles to buy bread before sunrise was going to buy bread before sunrise, regardless of what she preferred. By the end of the second week, his arrival had become a pattern. He came 3, sometimes 4 mornings out of 7, always before the shop opened, always at the back door. He drank the coffee she didn't ask if he wanted, and ate whatever she had, cooling on the rack, and occasionally asked questions about what she was working on, Not the polite, disinterested questions that people ask to fill silence, but actual questions, the kind that required real answers. He asked why she pressed the crust rather than rolling it. He asked what temperature she preferred for fruit filling and why. He asked what was wrong with a batch she had discarded one morning, and she explained the problem with the flour-to-fat ratio, and he listened in a way that she wasn't used to being listened to. She told herself it was a business arrangement. He was a good customer who arrived consistently and paid without complaint. The fact that he asked questions didn't mean anything except that he was more curious than most. She did not tell herself that she had started putting the better coffee on before 4:30. She didn't examine that. Vivienne noticed him on the third week. She came downstairs one morning in a wrapper and loose hair, intending to find something in the kitchen, and stopped in the doorway when she saw Rhett Calloway sitting at the work table with a mug of coffee and a half-eaten slice of bread, listening to Mabel explain the difference between active and dead yeast cultures. Vivienne stood there for a moment. Then she smiled, the specific smile she used when she had identified something she wanted, and she smoothed her hair with one hand and stepped into the room. "Good morning," she said. Her voice in the morning was different from her voice at any other time, lower, slower, as if she were still half in a dream. Rhett looked up, acknowledged her politely, and looked back at Mabel. "So the temperature of the water matters more than the amount of yeast?" Mabel kept her eyes on the dough she was turning. "Always. Kill the yeast with water that's too hot, and it doesn't matter how much you use. You've got dead flour at that point. Might as well bake a rock." Rhett nodded. Vivienne stood in the doorway for another few seconds, waiting for something. When nothing came, she turned and went back upstairs. Mabel did not look up from the dough, but her hands had gone very still for just a moment, and she had felt something move through her chest. Not triumph, exactly. Not hope either. Something more complicated and considerably less comfortable than either of those things. The Harvest Festival was held on the last Saturday of October, which Red Hollow treated as the nearest thing to a civic holiday. The town square was hung with lanterns, and every merchant who had anything to sell set up a table, and the social committee organized a baking competition that drew entries from across 3 townships. Mabel had entered the peach tart. She had spent the last 2 weeks refining it, and she believed, privately, and without saying it to anyone, that it was finished. The crust was right. The spice balance was right. The fruit-to-filling ratio was right. She had found the thing she had been looking for in August, and it was sitting on a ceramic plate wrapped in cloth, and she carried it to the festival table with both hands and set it down and went to find a place to stand where she could see the judges without being directly in anyone's line of sight. She did not look for Rhett. She was not going to look for Rhett. She looked for Rhett. He was on the far side of the square, talking to the mayor's assistant. He had come from the ranch in clean clothes, still work-worn at the cuffs, still boots rather than dress shoes, but he had made an effort. He was listening to the mayor's assistant with the same quality of attention he gave to her explanations about yeast and water temperature, and she found this information more meaningful than she wanted to. She looked away. She went to find somewhere to stand. She had been standing near the back of the crowd for approximately 10 minutes when she heard Vivienne's voice rise from somewhere close to the competition table, warm and certain, and carrying the particular social ease that Mabel had spent her whole life watching her sister deploy like a tool. "Yes, the peach tart is mine. I've been developing the recipe all autumn." Mabel went still. She turned slowly. Vivienne was standing beside the competition table with 3 of the town's more prominent women and one of the festival judges, and she was smiling and accepting the compliments being offered about the taste of the tart that the judge had apparently already sampled, and she was nodding as if every word coming out of her mouth was simple fact. "The spice combination especially," Vivienne said. "I spent weeks on the ratio." Mabel stood at the back of the crowd and did not move. She was not surprised. This was the part that would strike most people as the most devastating detail, and it was also, in the specific and exhausting way that long-standing cruelties work, completely unsurprising. She had kept the recipe from Vivienne for a reason. The reason was standing in front of the competition table accepting credit for something she had not touched. What surprised her was Rhett. He appeared from somewhere to her left, moving through the crowd toward the table, and she watched him stop and take a small plate from the judge's assistant and eat a bite of the tart. Deliberately, carefully, in the way he tasted things he was paying attention to. And then he looked up. He wasn't looking at Vivienne. He was looking across the crowd with a slight frown, scanning, and when his eyes found Mabel at the back of the gathering, something in his expression settled. He looked back at Vivienne. "Miss Hart," he said, "which spices did you use?" Vivienne smiled. "Oh, the usual, cinnamon, a touch of nutmeg." A short pause. "What kind of ginger?" The smile didn't falter, but something behind it did. "Pardon?" "Fresh or dried, the ginger in this crust. Which did you use?" Vivienne's expression held for 2 more seconds. Then, "Fresh, of course." Rhett set his plate down quietly. "That's interesting," he said, "because whoever made this used dried ginger, not fresh. The texture's completely different. And there's something else in here, cardamom, I think, in a ratio I've never tasted before." He turned toward the crowd. "Mabel, would you come here?" The silence that dropped over that section of the festival was the kind that has weight. Vivienne's face did something Mabel had never seen it do before. It lost its arrangement, just for a second. The social architecture came apart, and underneath it was something raw and very cold. Mabel walked forward. She didn't hurry. She moved through the people who stepped aside without quite looking at her, and she came to stand beside the table, and she looked at her sister, and she waited. "Is this yours?" Rhett asked. He was looking at Mabel, not at Vivienne. "Yes," Mabel said. A single word. Not defensive, not angry, just accurate. Vivienne's composure came back in pieces, and when it was fully assembled again, it was a different shape than before, harder, with less warmth in the eyes. "I don't know what she told you," Vivienne said, her voice carefully modulated. "But this has been a family recipe for—" "Vivienne," Mabel said it quietly, not cruelly, just as a fact. "Stop." And Vivienne, for the first and perhaps only time in Mabel's memory, stopped. But the silence that followed had a texture, and it wasn't over. What happened next happened fast. The way things do when a person who has held something in for a very long time suddenly decides that the holding is finished. Vivienne turned to the crowd, to the women she knew, to the faces watching, to the audience she had always understood how to read, and her voice lifted into something just at the edge of control. "She's always been like this," Vivienne said, "always trying to take credit for the things I build, for the things I've contributed to this family. You all know what she is. You've seen it your whole lives." Her voice cracked, whether from genuine feeling or performance, Mabel could not tell, and at this point did not particularly care. "She's nothing but a kitchen woman, unattractive, ungrateful, destined to die alone because no man with any sense would look twice at someone like Miss Hart." Rhett's voice cut through it cleanly. Not loud, not angry, just definitive. Vivienne stopped. The crowd was completely silent now. Rhett walked around the table and crossed the small distance to where Mabel was standing, and he extended his hand, not offering help, not offering pity, offering an invitation, the specific kind that a man extends in a public place when he means everyone to understand something by it. "Dance with me," he said. Not a request, quite. Something between a request and a statement of intent. Mabel looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She was aware of every person in the town square watching this moment, aware of Vivienne's silence behind her, aware of her own flower-roughened palms and the dress she had not chosen with any thought of dancing. She took his hand. He led her to the open space near the musicians, and the musicians, with the particular social intelligence of people who play for crowds and understand exactly what a room requires, began to play. And Mabel Hart, who had spent 25 years making herself smaller in every available direction, stood in the center of Red Hollow's Harvest Festival and danced with the man the entire town had been waiting to see choose someone. He had chosen her. She did not understand it yet. She wasn't sure she believed it yet. But her hand was in his, and the music was playing, and the crowd was watching, and for one long and complicated and entirely unresolved moment, Mabel Hart felt something she had spent her entire life learning to live without. Seen. Behind her, in the lantern light, Vivienne stood alone beside the competition table and watched her sister move across the festival floor. And what moved across her face in that moment was not grief and was not shame. It was the particular look of a woman who has just decided that something needs to be destroyed. The dance ended before the song did. Mabel was the one who stepped back first. She did it without apology, without the fluttering embarrassment another woman might have performed for the benefit of the crowd. She simply stepped back, released his hand and said, "Thank you," in the same tone she used when a customer paid on time, genuine, brief, and without any implication that she expected it to happen again. Rhett let her go. He didn't chase the moment or try to extend it into something it wasn't ready to be. The musicians finished the song they had started and moved into something livelier, and the crowd rearranged itself the way crowds do after they've witnessed something that will be discussed for weeks. Slowly, with people drifting into small groups, murmuring, glancing back at the space where something had just occurred. Mabel walked to the edge of the square and found a place near the water trough where no one was standing and where the lantern light didn't quite reach. And she stood there and told herself, very firmly, not to feel anything in particular about the last 10 minutes. She was not entirely successful. The problem with being seen, she was discovering, was that it left you exposed in directions you hadn't prepared for. She had spent so many years learning to manage invisibility that visibility felt like standing in a field without a coat. Not unpleasant, exactly, but alarming in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. She looked across the square for Vivienne. Vivienne was gone. She found her sister in the bakery kitchen when she got home, which was unusual because Vivienne didn't come into the kitchen by choice. She was sitting at the work table with her hands flat on the surface and her back very straight, and when Mabel came through the door, Vivienne didn't move. "Sit down," Vivienne said. "It's my kitchen." "Mabel, sit down." There was something in her voice that Mabel hadn't heard before. Not anger, because anger from Vivienne she knew well, had catalogued it across years. This was something with more architecture to it, more planning. Mabel stayed standing, because she had learned early that a conversation in which the other person tells you to sit down is a conversation they have already decided the terms of, and she preferred to enter conversations on her own terms when possible. "Say whatever you came to say," Mabel told her. Vivienne looked at her for a long moment. Then, "You embarrassed me. You lied to a crowd of people and took credit for 3 weeks of my work." "It was a festival competition, Mabel. It was the peach tart I developed in August and spent 2 weeks refining, and you've never once touched the recipe or the equipment I used to make it." Mabel's voice was level, not raised. She had discovered a long time ago that raised voices gave Vivienne something to react to, and she was not in the mood to give her sister anything tonight. "What did you want to say?" Vivienne's jaw tightened. "He's not for you." "Excuse me. Rhett Calloway. Whatever you think happened tonight, it wasn't what it looked like." "I'm not thinking anything about Rhett Calloway." "You're thinking everything about Rhett Calloway, and you're going to make a fool of yourself, and it's going to embarrass both of us." Vivienne stood up, and when she stood, she had the physical ease that Mabel had never possessed, the kind of unconscious grace that certain bodies moved through the world with. "Men like that don't choose women like you, Mabel. That's not cruelty. That's just how things are. I was being kind, making a point. Men like that make points sometimes." Mabel looked at her sister. She considered several responses. She selected the one that required the least energy. "Good night, Vivienne." Vivienne left. Mabel stood in the kitchen alone and listened to her sister's footsteps on the stairs, and then she turned to the oven because there was always something that needed checking, and she checked it, and she told herself that Vivienne was probably right, and she told herself this with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has repeated a particular story to herself so many times she can do it without any visible effort. She did not fully believe it tonight the way she usually did. That was the problem with being seen. It made the familiar story harder to tell. Rhett came to the back door the following Tuesday at 4:40 in the morning. Mabel had the coffee on. She didn't remark on this. Neither did he. He sat at the work table and drank his coffee and watched her work. And after a while he said, "Your sister came to the ranch yesterday." Mabel's hands kept moving. She was portioning dough, and she did not stop. "Did she?" "She brought a pie." A pause. "I think it was store-bought from the Hendersons. There were marks on the crust from their pan." Mabel almost smiled. She kept her face toward the dough. "She stayed for about an hour," Rhett said. "Told me a fair amount about Red Hollow, about your family, about the bakery." "I expect she did." "She told me you inherited the business and that she helps run it with you." Now Mabel did stop. She set down the dough, wiped her hands on her apron, and turned to look at him. "Vivienne has not worked a day in this bakery since our mother died. She has not contributed to its operation in any measurable way. She lives here because I pay the mortgage, and I have been paying the mortgage since I was 19 years old." She said it without heat, as fact. Rhett nodded. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man confirming something he had already suspected. "I thought something like that might be the case," he said. "Why are you telling me she came?" He turned his coffee mug in his hands, a habit she had noticed, something he did when he was thinking about how to say something. "Because I thought you should know. And because I'm going to keep coming here in the mornings, and I didn't want there to be something between us that I knew about, and you didn't." The word between landed in the kitchen, and neither of them addressed it directly. Mabel turned back to the dough. "The coffee's better on Tuesdays," she said. "I use the good beans." "I noticed," he said. Another silence, the kind she had started to recognize as one of his, comfortable, unhurried, not requiring anything from her. "What are you hoping to find?" she asked. She hadn't planned to ask it. It came out of some place she hadn't opened the door to on purpose. "Coming here before sunrise, talking to me about yeast. You're the wealthiest man in the county, and you have, I'm told, perfectly functional social relationships with people who are considerably more," she paused, selecting, "more what this town considers appropriate." Rhett was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she had pushed past some boundary she hadn't seen. "I don't like most of what this town considers appropriate," he said finally. "I've spent 7 years being told what I should want and who I should want it with, and the women this town keeps putting in my path they're not bad people, but they're all performing something, all of them. Every conversation is a performance, and I'm supposed to watch it and decide which performance I want to spend my life with." He stopped, turned the mug again. "You don't perform anything. I don't have the energy for it." "I know, that's what I mean." Mabel looked at her hands, at the dough, at the ordinary, unglamorous work of the morning. "You should be careful," she said, "about confusing plain manners for something more valuable than they are." "I don't think that's what I'm doing." "You've known me for 3 weeks." "I know." He stood, finished the last of his coffee, set the mug on the rack. "I'll see you Thursday." He left through this back door, and she listened to his horse move away down the alley, and she stood in the kitchen for a full minute before she went back to the dough. Her hands were slightly unsteady. She noticed this and was annoyed by it, and worked until they weren't. The railway contract letter arrived the second week of November. Mabel had been watching for it since October, checking with the post office every few days, managing her hope the way she managed most things she couldn't control, by keeping it small and contained and not letting herself build too much on top of it. The letter was from the Celebration Committee chairman, a man named Aldous Pratt, who worked out of the county seat and had the particular bureaucratic handwriting of someone who considered every correspondence a formal occasion. It was 2 pages, and Mabel stood at the post office counter and read both of them with the postmaster pretending not to watch her from behind his partition. The committee had selected her: 300 portions of bread, 40 pies, and 20 specialty pastries for the governor's arrival banquet, to be delivered the morning of November 19th. Payment upon delivery, with a substantial deposit to cover supplies, available immediately from the committee treasurer at the county courthouse. Mabel folded the letter, put it in her coat pocket, and walked back to the bakery. She sat in the kitchen and read the letter again. Then she did the numbers, the supply costs, the labor hours, the equipment she would need to run at the volume the contract required, and what would remain after those expenses cleared. What would remain was enough to pay off 2 years of the bakery mortgage. In a single job. She sat with this for a while. Then she got up and started making a list. She did not tell Vivienne about the letter. She did not tell Vivienne about the deposit, which she collected 3 days later from the county treasurer, riding to the courthouse herself and returning with an envelope that she locked in the iron box under the floorboard in the back storage room. She did not tell Vivienne about the supply orders she placed that week, or the extra equipment she arranged to borrow from the hotel kitchen for the production days, or the 2 women she hired on a short-term basis to help with volume. She had learned something across 25 years of living with her sister. Information was currency, and Vivienne spent every currency she found. What she told Vivienne was that they had a busy November ahead, and that Vivienne should plan to be out of the kitchen for most of it. Vivienne didn't ask why. She rarely asked about the kitchen. Rhett found out about the contract from the mayor's assistant, who mentioned it in passing at the feed store, and he came to the bakery that Saturday, not at 4 in the morning, but at a normal hour, mid-afternoon, when the shop was between rushes, and Mabel was restocking the front display. "I heard about the railway contract," he said. She kept arranging the bread. "Word travels. It's a significant contract, biggest one the committee's given to a single baker in the county. I know what it is. I'm not questioning whether you can handle it." He leaned against the counter in the way he had of occupying space without crowding it. "I wanted to say congratulations." Mabel looked up at him. It was not a complicated look, but it was a real one, the kind she didn't distribute easily. "Thank you," she said. "Do you need anything? Supplies? Equipment? I've got storage space at the ranch that's not being used if you run out of room." She considered this. The practical part of her recognized it as a genuine offer from someone who had resources she currently lacked. The other part of her, the part she was still learning to name, recognized it as something else, and was not sure what to do with the something else. "I might need cold storage for the pies the day before delivery," she said. "You've got it. I'll pay you for the use of it." "You won't." "Rhett." "Mabel." He said her name the way she said his. Simply, without decoration. "Let me help." She looked at him for another moment, then nodded and went back to the bread. He stayed for another hour. He didn't hover or offer opinions she hadn't asked for. He sat on the stool she kept behind the counter for slow afternoons and drank coffee and occasionally handed her things when her hands were full, and at some point she realized that the afternoon had moved past the point where she usually noticed the silence of the shop after closing, because it hadn't been silent. He left before dark. She watched him go from the front window, then turned back to the counter and found she was standing still for no particular reason, and she shook herself and went to do the day's accounting. The numbers were good. The numbers were better than they'd been in 2 years. She had a contract, a plan, and enough competence to execute both of them. She told herself she was content. She almost managed to believe it. Vivienne noticed anyway. She always noticed, eventually. That had been true their whole lives. Vivienne's attention was unreliable and scattered until it found something she considered relevant to herself. And then it became very sharp, very fast. She came downstairs one evening when Mabel was reviewing the production schedule and sat across from her at the kitchen table without being invited and said, "He's coming here again, isn't he?" Mabel didn't look up from the schedule. "Who?" "Don't be stupid. It doesn't suit you." "He comes in for bread. He's a paying customer." "He comes before we're open." "He's a paying customer who comes early." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, lost the sharp edge, taken on something softer and more careful. "I know I handled the festival badly." Mabel looked up. "I know that." Vivienne folded her hands on the table. She had their mother's hands, narrow, pale. "It was wrong of me. The tart was yours. I shouldn't have said what I said in front of everyone." Mabel watched her sister's face and tried to read it with the expertise she had developed across a lifetime of reading it, and what she found was ambiguous. Vivienne was not incapable of real remorse. She had seen it happen, rarely, in the years since their mother died. Moments where the performance cracked, and the actual person came through, confused and not quite prepared for herself. This might be one of those moments. It also might not. "What do you want, Vivienne?" Something moved across her sister's face. "I want—" She stopped, started again. "I want you to be careful. With him. I don't want to see you get hurt. That's very generous. I mean it." "I believe you might," Mabel said, and she meant it in the complicated way that the truth of a thing and the purpose of a thing can exist separately. Vivienne might genuinely not want to see Mabel hurt. That didn't mean her reasons were entirely without self-interest. "He's going to choose someone eventually," Vivienne said. "Men like that always do. And when he does—" "Vivienne," Mabel put down her pencil. "I'm going to say this once. I don't know what Rhett Calloway is or isn't going to do. I have a bakery to run and a contract to fulfill, and I am not spending any part of this evening talking about a man's intentions. If you have something real to say it. Otherwise, let me work." Vivienne stood. She looked at her sister for a moment with an expression that might have been hurt and might have been something being filed away for later. She went upstairs. Mabel picked up her pencil and looked at the schedule without seeing it for a full minute before she found her place again. November moved fast. The way November always did, with the cold settling in hard, and the days shortening, and the work expanding to fill more hours than the calendar seemed to technically allow. Mabel's production schedule ran 18 days. She began the non-perishable elements first, the dry ingredient mixes, the pastry doughs that needed aging, the spice blends she made in bulk and stored in sealed tins. The two women she'd hired, Dora Leach and a younger woman named Petra, who had trained briefly at a hotel kitchen in San Antonio, came in every morning at 5 and stayed until the afternoon. And Mabel discovered that having competent people in the kitchen with her was a different experience than she'd expected. She had run the bakery alone, or near alone, for so long that she had developed a kind of efficient isolation, a rhythm that belonged only to her, and it required genuine adjustment to work around other people who had their own rhythms. There were 3 days in the second week where she and Dora nearly argued, not quite argued, but came close, over the temperature of the oven during the large bread batches. Mabel was right about the temperature. She was also, in retrospect, blunter about it than necessary. She apologized. It came out awkward because she didn't do it often, but she said it, and Dora accepted it, and after that the kitchen ran better. Rhett came twice during the production period. He didn't stay long, so he understood the work had rhythm, and intruding on it would make him unhelpful, and unhelpful was the thing he seemed most determined not to be. He brought her firewood the first time, which she hadn't asked for but genuinely needed. The second time he came to arrange the cold storage for the pies, and they spent 40 minutes working out the logistics. And somewhere in the middle of it, Mabel made him write down the storage temperatures because she didn't trust verbal agreements on anything she cared about getting right. He wrote them down. "You don't trust easily," he said. "I trust evidence." She took the paper from him and read it over. "You've given me evidence. So." He looked at her for a moment. "That's the most generous thing you've said to me. Don't read too much into it." "I won't." But the almost smile was there again, and this time she saw it. 3 days before the delivery, Vivienne came into the kitchen at 11 at night. Mabel was alone. Dora and Petra had left at 8. The kitchen was warm and flour-thick with the smell of the last pie batches cooling on the racks, and Mabel was doing final counts on the inventory against her schedule when Vivienne appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, with her hair down and her face doing something complicated. "Something's wrong," Vivienne said. Mabel looked up. "With the oven." Vivienne pointed toward the main baking unit at the far wall. "I could smell it from upstairs. Something's different." Mabel crossed the kitchen and opened the oven door and checked the interior, then checked the flue, then stood and listened to the way the fire was drawing. Vivienne was right. There was a sound in the flue that hadn't been there yesterday, a slight inconsistency in the draw, the kind that meant either the flue was partially blocked or there was a crack somewhere in the housing developing. Mabel stood in front of the oven and did the math. 3 days. 20 more pies to bake tomorrow. Final quality check the morning of delivery. She couldn't lose the oven. "It's the flue," she said, more to herself than to Vivienne. "I need to check it from the roof." At 11 at night? Tomorrow morning the oven needs to be running by 4. She was already pulling her coat from the hook by the door. "If I don't check it tonight, I find out at 4 in the morning when I can't fix it." Vivienne looked at her sister in the coat she was pulling on over her work clothes and said, "I'll come." Mabel turned. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to. I'll hold the lamp." They went up to the roof in the November cold, Vivienne holding the lamp while Mabel climbed the slope to the chimney cap and examined the flue assembly with numb fingers and the kind of focused attention she applied to things that required getting right. The block was a piece of debris, a chunk of crumbled mortar that had shifted and was sitting at an angle in the throat of the flue, not blocking it entirely but restricting the draw enough to affect the burn. She got it out. Took 12 minutes and a scraping tool and 2 broken nails and one moment where the cold made her lose her grip on the chimney cap, and she grabbed the roof edge and held. Vivienne, from below, said, "Mabel, I'm fine." "You don't sound fine." "I'm fine, Vivienne. Hold the lamp still." She got back down from the roof, and they went inside, and Mabel checked the oven again, and the draw was right, clean. They stood in the warm kitchen, both of them cold from the roof, neither of them entirely sure what the last half hour had been. "You could have just had it checked in the morning," Vivienne said. "You might have had time." "I might not have." Vivienne looked at her, really looked, the way she didn't often do. "You work harder than anyone I've ever known," she said. "I want you to know I know that." Mabel didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Put the kettle on if you're staying up." Vivienne put the kettle on. They sat in the kitchen and drank tea and didn't talk very much. And it was, Mabel thought afterward, one of the stranger and more genuine hours she had shared with her sister in years. It didn't resolve anything between them. It didn't clean up the years of imbalance or the festival or the 2 decades of Mabel working while Vivienne was admired. But it was real in the way that some small moments are real, and she didn't dismiss it. She filed it, though, with some caution, because she had learned that with Vivienne, the real moments sometimes preceded the ones that weren't. The delivery morning came with frost on the ground, and a sky so clear and cold it looked carved from something. Mabel, Dora, and Petra loaded the bakery wagon before 5 in the morning. Bread stacked in cloth-wrapped rows, pies nested in straw-lined crates from Rhett's cold storage, pastries wrapped individually in paper. Mabel did 3 full counts before she allowed the wagon to move. The governor's event was at the railway platform, which had been decorated with bunting and lanterns, and the general air of civic pride that small frontier towns assembled with more enthusiasm than experience. The committee chairman, Aldous Pratt, met them at the back of the platform tent and walked the delivery with Mabel himself, checking against his list with a pedantry she found professionally familiar and therefore not irritating. Everything was there. Everything was correctly made. Pratt shook her hand at the end with the careful formality of a man who had not expected to be impressed and was adjusting to it. "Exceptional work, Miss Hart," he said. "We'll be in touch about future engagements." Mabel nodded, thanked him, and walked back to the wagon. She didn't cry. She was not a woman who cried at professional accomplishments because she was too tired and too clear-eyed about what came next, which was going back to the bakery, cleaning the equipment, paying Dora and Petra, starting the accounts, and opening the shop at 7 because it was still Tuesday and Red Hollow still needed bread. But when she climbed up onto the wagon seat and picked up the reins, she sat there for just a moment and let herself feel it. The specific private satisfaction of something completed entirely on her own terms, without anyone's help except the help she had deliberately sought and fairly compensated. She had done it. Rhett was at the edge of the platform. She hadn't seen him arrive. He must have come late, or she'd been too focused on the delivery to notice. He was standing with his hat in his hand in the morning cold, and when she met his eyes from the wagon seat, he didn't say anything across the distance. He just nodded once. She nodded back. Then she clicked the horse forward and drove the wagon back toward Clement Street, and she didn't look back, because looking back was a habit she had been working to break, and she was making progress. Behind her, on the platform, she did not see Vivienne, but Vivienne had been there. She had watched the whole thing from the edge of the crowd, the handshake with Pratt, the full crates, the nodded exchange with Rhett. And her face in that moment was the one Mabel never saw, the face she kept for private calculations. Vivienne was not a simple woman. She was not purely cruel, but she was a woman who had organized her entire life around a certain understanding of how things worked, what she deserved, what she was owed, what others had that she didn't. And what she had watched this morning on the railway platform was her sister receiving something that Vivienne had never earned and could not take, and it was being handed to her by a world that had never handed Vivienne anything she hadn't performed extensively for. That understanding did something to the cold place behind her eyes. She walked back to the bakery on Clement Street and stood in the empty kitchen and looked at the space her sister had filled for 25 years, and she thought about Deputy Silas Crow, who had tried twice to buy land from the Calloway ranch that Rhett had refused to sell, and who had come into the bakery 2 weeks ago looking for Rhett, and left Vivienne his card instead with a message she had not passed on to anyone. She took the card out of the pocket of her coat. She looked at it for a long time. Then she did not throw it away. Vivienne kept the card for 11 days before she used it. Mabel didn't know this. She was busy in the way that a successful person becomes busy after a success. Not the frantic busy of crisis management, which she knew well, but the steadier, more demanding busy of someone who has proven something and now has to keep proving it at scale. The railway committee paid within the week, as promised. Aldous Pratt sent a second letter 2 days after the first, this one less formal, asking whether Hart Bakery would be available for the spring circuit court sessions, which required catering for a 3-day judicial gathering at the county courthouse. It was smaller than the railway contract, but recurring, and recurring was better than large. Mabel wrote back the same afternoon and said yes. She also started looking at the bakery's lease agreement, which she hadn't read carefully in 2 years. The building on Clement Street was rented, not owned, a detail she had accepted as permanent when she was 19 and exhausted and had no capital for anything else. Now she did the numbers again, with the railway payment sitting in the iron box under the floorboard and the spring contract signed on paper. And the numbers said something different than they had said before. They said, possible. She didn't tell anyone she was thinking about purchasing the building. She didn't tell Rhett, who had started coming by on Saturday afternoons in addition to the early mornings, and whose presence in the shop had become a fact of her weekly routine in the way that the flower delivery and the account books had become facts. She didn't tell Dora, who had taken on part-time work after the railway job and had become useful in the way that competent people become useful when you give them room to work. She didn't tell Vivienne. She took the lease agreement to the land office clerk on a Wednesday when the shop was closed for restocking, and she asked him to explain the purchase option clause in the third paragraph, which she had read 4 times and understood, but wanted confirmed by someone with legal authority to confirm things. The clerk, a young man named Gideon Falk, who had the slightly harried look of someone managing more paperwork than he'd expected when he took the job, read the clause and confirmed what she'd understood. The landlord's required to offer you first right of purchase if he decides to sell, Falk said. It's in the original lease, signed 1874. My father signed it. Yes, ma'am. But you've been operating as the lessee since 1876 without interruption, so the agreement transfers. He looked at the document and then at her. You thinking of buying? I'm thinking about it. He nodded, which was the right response, and she took the lease back and walked home. She put it back in the iron box with the money and the spring contract and the railway payment receipt, and locked the box and put it under the floorboard. She was building something. She could feel it the way you feel weather coming, in the pressure of things, in the way the air had changed around her daily work. It was still uncertain, and it was still fragile, and she had learned too many times what happened when you let yourself believe something was solid before it was. But she could feel it. She did not let herself believe it was solid, but she let herself feel the possibility, which was more than she had allowed in years. Rhett asked her to dinner on a Saturday in late November. He did it without preamble, which she had come to expect from him. He came into the shop at mid-afternoon, bought a loaf of the dark rye he'd taken to ordering specifically, and then, while she was wrapping it, said, "Have dinner with me, not here, at the hotel restaurant, Tuesday evening." Mabel wrapped the bread without changing her pace. "That's a very public place." "I know. People will talk. People are already talking. They've been talking since the Harvest Festival." She looked at him. "And that doesn't concern you." "What concerns me is that I've been coming to your back door before sunrise for 2 months, and I've never taken you anywhere." He folded his arms on the counter in the way he did when he was being direct and wanted her to understand he was being direct. "I'd like to take you somewhere, if you'll let me." Mabel put the bread on the counter between them. She thought about what Vivienne had said that night in the kitchen. Men like that make points sometimes. She thought about Gideon Falk and the lease and the iron box under the floorboard. She thought about the way she had spent 25 years making herself convenient and small and without needs that might inconvenience anyone. "Tuesday," she said, 7 o'clock. He picked up the bread and paid and left, and she turned back to the counter and spent approximately 4 seconds standing completely still before she went to see what the afternoon deliveries needed. She wore her best dress, which was navy wool with brass buttons at the cuffs. It was not a fashionable dress. Fashion in Red Hollow was aspirational and slightly behind the times, and Mabel's interest in fashion was practical rather than passionate. But it was well made and clean, and she had altered it the previous winter to fit her properly rather than approximately, which made a difference. She looked at herself in the mirror above the washstand before she left. She did this infrequently and briefly as a rule, the way you briefly check weather before stepping outside, enough to know what you're dealing with, not long enough to develop opinions about it. She looked, she determined, like herself. Clear-eyed, broad-shouldered, capable. Not beautiful in the way Vivienne was beautiful, and she had made sufficient peace with this that the thought arrived without particular pain. She was halfway down the stairs when Vivienne appeared in the hallway below. Vivienne looked at the dress, looked at the way Mabel had put her hair up, which she almost never did, looked at the hour. It was 20 minutes to 7. "You're going to dinner with him," Vivienne said. "Yes." A pause. "The hotel restaurant?" "Yes."
Vivienne's face cycled through something Mabel couldn't entirely read. Then she said, "You have a loose thread at the left cuff, button second from the end." She went back to the sitting room without another word. Mabel looked at the cuff. There was, in fact, a loose thread. She pulled it cleanly and went out. She didn't know what to make of that. She filed it alongside the rooftop night and the tea and the other genuine moments, and she kept the caution she'd kept before. And she walked to the hotel restaurant and didn't think about it anymore. Dinner was not what she expected, which was her own fault for expecting anything in particular. She had braced for performance, for the version of a formal dinner in which both people are actively demonstrating their suitability for something, testing and being tested, each conversation a small assessment. She had been through enough awkward public interactions in Red Hollow to know how they felt. That particular quality of self-consciousness when you're aware that the room is observing you and forming conclusions. What happened instead was closer to the mornings in the bakery, which surprised her enough that she was quiet for the first 10 minutes trying to recalibrate. Rhett ordered without consulting the waiter unnecessarily. He didn't perform comfort in expensive places. He just was comfortable, which wasn't the same thing. He asked her about the spring contract and listened to the answer without redirecting to himself. He told her about a problem he'd been having with one of his northern water sources, a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Otis Pruitt over a creek boundary that had been imprecisely surveyed 30 years ago and was now contested in ways that had consumed 3 months of his attention. "What's the actual boundary?" Mabel asked. "My surveyor says it's 14 feet north of where Pruitt's surveyor says it is." "Then get a third surveyor." "I have. His opinion is that both previous surveys are partially wrong, and the actual boundary is somewhere between the two, which is either the most honest answer or the most useless one, depending on your mood." "It's both," Mabel said. "Get the original land grant document from the territorial office. The surveyors are working from copies. Get the original." Rhett looked at her. "My father had a boundary dispute with the merchant 2 doors down when I was 12, she said. "He spent 2 years and 3 surveyors on it. The original deed settled it in an afternoon." "Did he win?" "He was right about the boundary. The deed confirmed it." "That's not quite what I asked." "No," she said. "The merchant's brother was on the town council, so formally they split the disputed 2 feet." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." "He got the 2 feet eventually. The merchant moved away in 1879. "And your father?" "Died in 1876. She said it without particular distress. It was old enough that it had become fact rather than wound. But he was right about the boundary, which he always said was the important part. He sounds like someone worth knowing. He was a better baker than I am, which is saying something because I'm not bad." Rhett laughed. Actually laughed. Not the polite version, but the real one that comes when something catches you off guard. Mabel watched it happen and felt something shift in the general region of her sternum that she decided not to investigate too carefully. They ate. They talked about bread and cattle and water rights and the way frontier towns either became something or didn't, and what determined the difference. They talked about what they'd each expected their lives to look like at this point versus what they actually looked like, which was the kind of conversation Mabel had not had with anyone in recent memory. "I thought I'd have sold the ranch by now," Rhett said. "When I inherited it, I thought, I'll run it a few years, stabilize it, sell it, go somewhere with more happening." "Why didn't you?" He turned his coffee mug. "It turned out I'm better at ranching than I expected to be, and better at it than I am at most other things." A pause. "Also, the land." "What about?" "It's mine," he said simply. "Really mine. I know every acre of it. I know where the water runs in spring and where it doesn't. I know which sections flood and which go dry. It's knowing a place that well does something to you, makes leaving seem like a loss you haven't calculated properly." Mabel looked at her hands around her coffee cup. She thought about the bakery on Clement Street, about the smell of the kitchen at 4 in the morning and the way the light came through the south window in January, about the flour merchant who'd tried to overcharge her for 2 years before she found an alternative supplier in the next county, and about how she'd felt the morning she signed the new supplier agreement. Not triumphant exactly, but correctly placed, like something that fit. "I know what you mean," she said. He looked at her in the way he looked at things he was paying attention to. "I thought you might,"
he said. They walked back to the bakery after dinner because she declined the offer of the buggy, because the evening was cold but clear, and she preferred the cold to the enclosed space of a buggy for reasons she didn't examine. He walked with her the 4 blocks to Clement Street, and at the bakery door he stopped. "Thank you," he said. "You paid for dinner." "I know. I'm thanking you for coming." She looked at him. The street was quiet, the town mostly settled in for the evening, the lanterns burning low outside the hotel behind them. "I'll see you Thursday," she said. He nodded. He didn't push for more, which was one of the things she was beginning to rely on, his understanding of where the line was. She went inside and locked the door and stood in the dark front room of the bakery for a moment before she turned up the lamp and went to check the kitchen. The kitchen was fine. Everything was where she'd left it. She stood there anyway for a while. In the warm dark of the place she had run alone for 6 years, and she allowed herself, carefully and with full awareness that she was doing it, to feel something close to hope. It was a dangerous thing to feel. She knew its history. She felt it anyway. Whoops. Vivienne met with Silas Crow for the first time on a Wednesday afternoon in early December. She chose the location herself, not the bakery, not anywhere on Clement Street. She walked to the far end of Main, past the hardware store and the stable, to the small building that housed Crow's deputy office, which shared a wall with the livery and smelled accordingly. Crow was not what she'd expected from the card, which had been plain and official. He was a compact man in his mid-40s with a sheriff's deputy badge that looked newer than the coat he was wearing, and small eyes that moved around a room in the way that some men's eyes do, assessing exits and advantages with the particular reflexiveness of someone who has needed that skill before. He had been expecting her. He stood when she came in and did not offer his hand, which she noted as either correct instinct or experience. "Miss Hart," he said, "Deputy Crow." She sat without being invited because she had learned that sitting first established something. "You left me your card 2 weeks ago. I apologize for the delay. I've been watching how the situation developed before deciding whether the conversation was worth having." Crow sat back down behind his desk. "And has it developed?" "Sufficiently." She folded her hands in her lap. "You want something from Rhett Calloway, something he's refused to give you." No reaction, which was itself a kind of reaction. "What makes you say that?" "You came to his bakery, my family's bakery, looking for him in November. You left your card with me when you couldn't find him, which means you wanted contact with someone in his proximity. And I know Rhett has refused 2 land inquiries from the South section in the past year. I assume one of them was yours." Crow studied her. "You know a fair amount about his business for a woman who runs a bread shop." "I pay attention." She met his eyes without difficulty. "I'm not here to discuss what you want from Calloway. I'm here because we may be able to help each other with a separate matter entirely." "What matter?" Vivienne looked at the window, at the gray December light coming through the dirty glass, then back at Crow. "My sister has a railway contract," she said, "and a spring courthouse contract, and she is developing, I believe, an understanding with Rhett Calloway that will give her access to resources and social standing she has not previously had." She paused. "I would like several things to become more difficult for her." Crow was quiet, the kind of quiet that thinks. "Why not just do it yourself?" he said. "Because the things I'd like made difficult require access I don't have, and a willingness to be visible that I'm not prepared to be." She was direct about this because being indirect with men like Crow was inefficient. "I want her reputation damaged before the spring contract executes. I want the railway committee to question their choice, and I want—" She stopped. "What?" "I want Calloway to see her as a liability before he commits to anything." Crow leaned forward on the desk. "That's not small." "No, it isn't." "What's my part of the exchange?" Vivienne reached into her coat and placed a folded paper on the desk. "That is a sworn statement regarding the survey on the Calloway Ranch's southern water boundary. My father helped survey that land in 1871. He kept records. I have his survey notes from that year, which contradict the current Calloway survey by 32 feet and would give the south section to the adjoining property, which I understand you've tried to acquire." Crow looked at the paper without touching it. "Those notes are real?" he said. "They're real. My father's handwriting, dated and witnessed." A long silence. Crow picked up the paper and unfolded it and read it slowly. "This could reopen the boundary question," he said.
That's the intention. And in exchange, you help me with my sister's situation. She stood. I don't need to know the details. I only need the outcome. Crow folded the paper. He didn't give it back. I'll need to think about this, he said. Of course. She picked up her gloves from her lap. But not for too long. The spring contract executes in March. She left. She walked back down Main Street in the cold December air and did not look back at the deputy's office. And she felt, walking back toward Clement Street, the same thing she always felt when she had put something into motion, a clean, quiet efficiency, like a mechanism clicking into place. She was not proud of it, but she was not ashamed of it either. That, had she known it, was perhaps the most dangerous part. December in the bakery was its own season. The holiday orders came in the third week of the month. Cakes, spiced breads, specialty pastries that Mabel only made in December because the ingredients were expensive and the preparation time was not justified at any other point in the year. She and Dora worked 12-hour days for most of the month, and Petra came back for the week before Christmas, and the shop had a line out the front door on the Saturday before the holiday that Mabel had not seen since her father was alive. She was tired in a way that had its own particular texture, not the grinding, hollow exhaustion of crisis years, but the solid tired of a person who has worked hard at something that mattered. She noticed the difference. Rhett came on Christmas morning with a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. She was alone in the bakery. Vivienne had gone to the Mercer family's holiday gathering, which she attended every year because the Mercers had money and social position, and Vivienne calibrated her social engagements accordingly. "Merry Christmas," he said at the back door. "The shop's closed." "I know. I'm not here for bread." He held out the parcel. "It's not much. Don't make it into something it isn't." She took it. Inside was a new account ledger, leather-bound, with her name embossed on the front. Below it, wrapped separately in cloth, was a set of measuring weights. Brass. Precise. The kind sold by a scientific instrument supplier in Austin, not by the general store in Red Hollow. She looked at them for a long time. "The general store weights are off," he said. "I noticed when you rechecked the coffee last month." She had noticed too. She'd been compensating for the discrepancy by feel for 2 years. "Thank you," she said. It came out differently than the way she usually said it. More open. He noticed. He didn't comment on it, which was the right choice. She made him coffee, and they sat in the warm kitchen on Christmas morning and talked for 2 hours about the ranch and the boundary dispute, which he had taken her advice on and was now waiting for the Territorial Records Office to produce the original land grant, and about the spring contract and what she was planning to expand in the new year, and about his family, which she realized she knew very little about. His parents had not been happy together. He said this plainly, without drama. They were suited in some ways and badly mismatched in others, and they spent most of their marriage managing the mismatch. "My father worked constantly. My mother left for San Antonio when I was 16 and came back twice." He turned his coffee mug. "I watched that for a long time. It's part of why I didn't rush into anything." "Part of why you haven't married," she said. "Yes." He looked at her across the work table. "I wanted to be sure before I committed. Not sure in the way you're sure about something safe. Sure in the way you're sure about something real." Mabel looked at the brass measuring weights sitting on the rack. "That's a reasonable standard," she said. "I've started to think I've found it," he said. The kitchen was quiet, the fire in the stove, the cold morning outside the window. "Rhett," she said it carefully, "I need you to understand that I am not a simple situation. I know. I have a business that I'm not willing to subordinate to anything else. I have a sister who is complicated. I'm not easy." She said the last part with some difficulty because it was true and it was important and she didn't want to pretend otherwise. "I have opinions and I am not inclined to soften them, and I have spent a long time learning to be self-sufficient, and I don't intend to unlearn it. I'm not asking you to. People always say that." "I know." He met her eyes. "I mean it." She looked at him for a long moment with all the assessment she was capable of, which was considerable. "All right," she said. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was a considered decision made by a woman who did not make decisions lightly, and it had all the weight of that behind it. He nodded. They finished their coffee. January came in hard,
with a cold snap that cracked boards and froze the water pump twice in the same week. And Mabel began the new year with a burst pipe in the back storage room that took 2 days and more money than she'd planned to spend before spring to fix. This was frontier life, the way a good month was always followed by something that needed managing. She managed it. She got the pipe fixed, recalculated the budget, moved some supply orders to February, and went back to work. Rhett helped with the pipe. He came with a plumber from the ranch who knew what he was doing, and they fixed it in an afternoon that would have taken Mabel 3 days to arrange and execute alone. She noted this in the ledger of her understanding of him, not as a debt, but as a data point. He was useful. He was the kind of person who showed up for the bad Tuesday as readily as for the good Saturday, and she had lived long enough to know that was the meaningful measurement. Vivienne was quiet in January in a way that Mabel noticed but couldn't quite categorize. She was there, present at meals, occasionally in the front room in the evenings, not absent or overtly withdrawn. But she was quiet with the particular quality of someone who is waiting for something, and Mabel, who knew her sister's silences as well as she knew her own, felt an unease she couldn't name and chose not to chase. She should have chased it. She would think about that later, many times, in the way you think about the thing you should have done when doing it would have mattered. Silas Crow began his work in January. He was methodical about it, which Mabel would learn later, in retrospect. He started with the railway committee. He had a contact on the committee, a man named Boyle, who owed him a favor from a land matter 2 years prior. And through Boyle, he introduced a question: had the committee fully vetted Hart Bakery's financial situation? Were they aware of the ownership irregularities? The bakery operating under a deceased man's original lease, the business run by a woman without formal legal standing as proprietor? The question was technically without foundation. Mabel had legal standing, but the question didn't need to be founded. It only needed to circulate. It circulated. In February, Aldous Pratt wrote a letter that was carefully worded and formally polite and deeply concerning, asking Mabel to provide documentation confirming her legal status as the bakery's operator before the spring contract finalized. She read the letter at the kitchen work table on a Tuesday morning and felt the specific chill of something coming apart in a direction she hadn't seen. She went immediately to Gideon Falk at the land office. "I need documentation confirming legal transfer of lease and operating status," she said. "Everything: original lease, transfer documentation, operating continuity records, whatever exists." Falk looked slightly alarmed by her directness but recovered quickly, which she had come to appreciate about him. "That'll take a few days to compile." 3 days, she said. "I have a contract deadline." 3 days, he agreed. She went back to the bakery and sat in the kitchen and thought carefully about the letter and about Pratt and about who might have raised the question with the committee and why, and she arrived, by a process of elimination she wouldn't have been able to fully articulate but which was nonetheless rigorous, at a name. She didn't have proof. She had the direction the wind was coming from, which in her experience was usually enough to start preparing. She told Rhett that evening. Not all of it. Not the conclusion she'd reached about the source of the question. She told him about the letter and the documentation request and the feeling she had that someone was working against her. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. "What do you need from me?" he said when she finished. "Nothing yet." She was sitting at the work table with the letter in front of her, and she looked at it and then at him. "I have documentation. I have legal standing. If Pratt is asking the question in good faith, the documents will answer it. If he's asking because someone pushed him to ask, the documents will still answer it, and then I'll know the question was pushed. And then? And then I'll deal with that separately." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "Mabel." "What?" "You don't have to handle everything alone." "I know." She looked at the letter. "But I'm better at handling things when I understand them completely, and right now I don't, so." She folded the letter. "Let me get the documents first." He didn't push further. He trusted her to know her own process, which was, she was learning, one of the things about him that was genuinely rare. Falk produced the documents in 3 days, as promised. Mabel sent them to Pratt by courier with a cover letter she wrote herself, 3 sentences, no apology, clear and factual. She received a response 8 days later confirming the documentation was satisfactory and the spring contract would proceed as agreed. She exhaled. But the unease didn't leave with the letter. It sat in the kitchen with her in the evenings, something she couldn't resolve because she hadn't yet located all of its sources. She looked at Vivienne's face across the dinner table and tried to read it the way she had read it her whole life and found something she didn't like in the particular steadiness of her sister's expression. Vivienne was not a woman who was normally steady. She was expressive and reactive and socially alive in a way that Mabel had envied at 14 and learned to simply observe by 20. This stillness was not Vivienne's natural register. It was the stillness of someone managing knowledge. Mabel thought about Deputy Silas Crow and his card that Vivienne had pocketed at the bakery in November. She thought about whether she had been wrong to leave that unaddressed. She thought about what she would do if she was right about the direction the wind was coming from. She didn't confront Vivienne. She wasn't ready. She needed more. What she didn't account for, what she had no framework to account for, because she had not fully understood the depth of what her sister was capable of, was how much had already been set in motion, and how little of it she would be able to stop before it arrived at her door. The night of the storm came at the end of February. She had seen it coming for 2 days in the way the sky looked over the western ridge, that particular bruised darkness that meant a front moving in with real intention. She had banked the ovens carefully, checked the flue, which had been repaired properly in November and had given her no trouble since, and locked the storage room in the front of the shop before going upstairs at 10 o'clock. She did not sleep well. The wind was loud, and she had the low-grade alertness of a woman whose livelihood lived on the ground floor of the building she slept in. She heard something at midnight, not the wind. Under it, a sound with a different quality. Something at the back of the building. She lay still for 3 seconds, listening. Then she got up. She was at the top of the stairs when the kitchen light flickered wrong. Not the way a lamp flickers in a draft, but the way a lamp flickers when it has moved, when something has disturbed it. She went down the stairs in the dark, one hand on the wall, without a lamp of her own because she knew every step. She pushed open the kitchen door. Silas Crow was standing beside the cooling rack with a crowbar in his hand, and Vivienne was across the room near the storage door with her back against the wall and her face doing something that Mabel had never seen it do. The look on Vivienne's face was the one Mabel would remember for a long time. Not guilt, exactly. Not surprise either. It was the look of someone who had believed, until this precise second, that there would be no moment of reckoning, and who now understood, with complete and devastating clarity, that they had been wrong. Nobody in the kitchen said anything. Then Crow moved toward the display rack, toward the 5-tier celebration cake Mabel had spent 4 days on, the centerpiece of the spring contract delivery. And he raised the crowbar, and Vivienne said, "Wait," but she said it half a second too late. The crowbar swung. The cake hit the floor in pieces. And Mabel Hart, standing in the doorway of her own kitchen at midnight with a storm raging outside, looked at the wreckage of 4 days of work and felt something in her chest go very, very quiet. Not empty. Not broken. Quiet in the way that certain kinds of anger go quiet, past the noise of feeling, down to the cold, clear place where decisions get made. Crow turned toward her. He had the crowbar and he had the size advantage and he had the look of a man who had committed too far to this to stop now. And he raised the bar toward the shelf where the kerosene lamps sat on their hooks above the work table. Vivienne said, "Silas, don't." He didn't listen. The lamp came off the hook. And the night, which had already been bad, became something else entirely. The lamp didn't shatter immediately. It fell from the hook in the particular slow-motion way that disasters announce themselves. Not fast, not cinematic, but with a horrible deliberateness, tumbling end over end and hitting the edge of the work table before it reached the floor. And the glass broke against the iron table leg, and the kerosene caught the flame from the pilot light on the secondary oven, and the fire that resulted was not the dramatic wall of flame that people describe afterward, but something smaller and faster and more purposeful, spreading across the wooden floor in the direction of the stored flour sacks against the east wall, before Mabel had fully processed that the lamp had fallen at all. Crow didn't wait. He was at the back door and through it in 4 seconds, the crowbar still in his hand, the door swinging open behind him into the storm. The cold night air hit the kitchen and the fire, which had been moving fast, moved faster. Mabel crossed the kitchen toward the flour sacks because flour burns and she knew it, and it was the first thing her hands understood to do. Drag them away from the fire, buy time, find the bucket by the water pump. She got 2 sacks clear before the flames reached the third, and the third caught,
and the smoke went from thin to thick in a way that changed the air quality of the room inside of 15 seconds. Vivienne, she turned. Her sister was still against the storage room wall, exactly where she'd been, not moving. Her face had gone completely white. Vivienne, the front door. Go. Vivienne didn't move. Now. Mabel grabbed the bucket and hit the pump handle 3 times and got water. Cold, weak pressure, winter slow, and threw it at the base of the east wall fire, which slowed it without stopping it. Vivienne, I need you to move. Vivienne made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The smoke was thickening above them. Mabel could feel it in her throat, the particular quality of a kitchen fire. Flour dust and wood and years of accumulated grease in the oven joints, all of it contributing. She had perhaps 2-3 minutes of useful visibility in this room. Maybe less. She went to her sister and grabbed her arm. Not gently, she had no time for gentle. She pulled Vivienne off the wall and pointed her toward the kitchen door and said, "Front room, go, don't stop." Vivienne went. Mabel turned back to the kitchen. The fire had reached the shelf rack on the east wall, the one with the dry spice tins and the stored baking supplies. And the wooden shelf was burning now, and 3 of the spice tins had fallen to the floor, and one of them was rolling, and the kerosene she could smell was still spreading because the broken lamp hadn't been the only one on the work table hook. She looked at the second lamp. It was on the hook above the fire. She looked at the door to the front room where Vivienne had gone. She looked at the iron box under the floorboard. The floorboard was in the storage room, and the storage room door was on the other side of the fire. She made the calculation in the way she made all calculations, quickly, practically, without sentiment. And the calculation said, the box is iron. The floor might not burn through. The documents inside might survive. Might. She did not know enough about fires to be certain, and she did not have time to find out. And the contract copies were at the land office anyway, and her life was not in the storage room. She left the storage room. She went through the kitchen door into the front room and found Vivienne stopped in the middle of the room, which was not yet filling with smoke but would be. And there was a reason Vivienne had stopped. The front of the building was intact. The front door was 8 feet away. But when Vivienne had moved through the kitchen, something had shifted in the burning shelf rack, and the sound of it, a structural settling, a deep wooden crack from somewhere above the kitchen, had transmitted through the building in a way that Vivienne had felt in her feet, and that had stopped her the way an unexpected noise stops an animal. "The building's settling," Mabel said. "The fire's in the kitchen, and it'll hold a while longer, but we need to leave now, Vivienne. We need to go." Vivienne turned. Her face in the dim lamplight of the front room was not the face Mabel had seen for 25 years. The beautiful, composed, socially managed face. It was someone younger and much more frightened. "I didn't," she started. "Not now." "Mabel, I didn't think he was going to—" "Vivienne," she took her sister's arm again. "We are leaving this building. We can talk when we're outside." She got her sister to the front door and she got the bolt open and the wind hit them. The full February storm, which had not moderated while they were inside, which was in fact worse than it had been at midnight, wet and bitterly cold, with the particular combination that turned everything it touched to ice within minutes. They came out onto the front steps of the bakery, and the cold was a physical thing, and Mabel stood on the steps with the storm at her face and looked at Clement Street and saw no one. Behind them, through the glass of the front window, she could see the glow of the kitchen fire. She went down the steps. She pulled Vivienne down with her and said, "Get across the street, stand in front of Miller's. Don't move from there, I'll find someone." "Where are you going?" "To Wake the Street." She went. She pounded on the door of the hardware merchant, Eli Morrow, who lived above his shop, and she pounded until a light went on upstairs, and she pounded on the adjacent door, which was the hat shop, and that light also came on, and she stood in the middle of Clement Street in the storm and yelled fire in the way that a woman who has been managing things alone for years yells fire, without panic, but with the full force of her voice and the complete understanding that volume was the tool, and she would use all of it. The street began to wake. She went back to the front of the bakery, and the window now showed more than a glow. The kitchen had spread to the storeroom. She could see it in the color of the light, the orange shifting to something whiter and more complete. And the upper back of the building, where the oven flue ran through the second floor, was producing smoke along the roofline that the storm kept tearing away and replacing. Vivienne was across the street in front of Miller's where Mabel had told her to go. She was standing with her arms around herself in the cold, watching the bakery. Mabel stood on the front step. She stood there longer than was strictly advisable, and she knew it, and she stood there anyway, because this was the place she had opened at 4 in the morning for 6 years, and the place her father had built from a rented room and a second-hand oven, and the place that had its flower in the east wall now burning, and its account ledger and its brass measuring weights on the kitchen work table, and she was standing outside of it in a storm watching it go, and she was not going back in. Then the upper floor shifted. She heard it before she saw it. Another deep crack, somewhere in the central beam structure above the kitchen. The kind of sound that means something is no longer holding what it's supposed to hold. She stepped back from the door. Neighbors were arriving now. Eli Morrow came with a bucket, then stopped and looked at the building and understood the bucket was wrong. 2 men from the far end of Clement Street appeared with another bucket. The hotel manager came out and saw the smoke and went back to send someone for the volunteer fire company, which in Red Hollow was 3 men with a wagon and a hand pump that worked better in summer. Mabel watched all of this from the street and managed what she could manage, which was directing people away from the building when they tried to approach it and keeping track of who was where. She did not think about what was inside. She would have time for that later, and she was not going to spend it now. Rhett arrived 22 minutes after the fire started. She did not know how long it had been until later, when she had time to reconstruct the sequence. In the moment, he appeared from the direction of the stable with his horse still blowing steam from the hard ride and his coat not fully buttoned and his face showing the particular expression of someone who has ridden fast through a storm because they had no choice. He saw her immediately. She was standing in the street in front of the bakery, which was by now burning from the kitchen through the second floor, and she was still in her nightgown with a coat she didn't remember putting on and her feet in boots she had laced without fully waking up. He crossed to her in about 6 strides. He didn't say anything. He looked at her face and then at the building and then back at her, and she could see him doing what she had done. Assessing, calculating, deciding what was urgent. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Is anyone inside?" "No. Vivienne's across the street." He looked across the street, then back at the building. The front window had cracked from the heat, and the front room was now part of the fire. She had seen it happen 4 minutes ago and had not looked away. "The iron box," he said. She looked at him. "Under the storage room floor, your documents, the railway payment." She had not told him about the iron box. She had not told anyone about the iron box. "How do you know about that?" she said. "You check the floorboard every time you pass the storage room door. Every time. I noticed in November and I didn't ask because it wasn't my business." He looked at the building. "Is the payment in it?" "Part of it, some of the contracts, the lease." She looked at the building too. "The storage room was on the fire side of the kitchen. I don't know if the floor held." "I do," he said. "Let me go in." "Rhett." Her voice came out different than she intended. She had meant it to be flat and practical, and it came out with something underneath that she hadn't authorized. "The upper floor is compromised. The east wall is gone. The floor above the kitchen will come down. I know how to move through a fire." That is not a sentence that means what you think it means. He looked at her. "I've been in burning buildings before. Ranch fires, twice." He said it without bravado. As information. "Tell me exactly where the storage room floorboard is relative to the door." "You are not Mabel." He put his hands on her shoulders, which she would later identify as the moment she understood something she had been working not to understand for 2 months. Not because of the gesture itself, but because of the quality of it. Not restraining, not reassuring in the hollow way people offer comfort, but present. Specifically present, to her specifically, in this specific moment. "Where is the floorboard?" she told him. He gave her his coat, not offered, transferred because her coat was thin and she was cold, and he went. She watched him go. She had spent 25 years being the person who went, who handled it, who came back from the roof at midnight with cracked fingernails and sorted it out. She stood in the February storm in Rhett's coat, and she watched someone else walk toward the burning building, and she felt something she did not have language for. Not helplessness, because she was still managing the scene, still directing people, still tracking what was happening. Something else, the specific and almost unbearable quality of caring whether someone came back. She hadn't felt that in a long time. He was inside for 4 minutes. She counted. The volunteer fire company arrived in the 3rd minute, their wagon and hand pump, and 3 men who were doing their genuine best,
which was better than nothing and not enough to save the building, but sufficient to begin keeping the fire from spreading to the hardware shop next door. Eli Morrow directed them. Mabel watched the front of the bakery. At 4 minutes and a few seconds, the front window frame came down. The upper floor released with the sound she had heard before, deeper and more final, and a section of the east wall dropped into itself, and Mabel took 2 steps toward the building before she stopped herself because going in would not help and she knew it. At 4 minutes and 30 seconds, Rhett came through the front door. He had the iron box under one arm, and his arm was wrapped around it in a way that had pulled his shirt across his back, and his face had the look of someone who has been in smoke and moved fast and knows the difference between the kind of situation you can work in and the kind you leave. He was coughing when he hit the street air, the deep chest cough of smoke inhalation, and he sat down on the step opposite the burning building and set the iron box between his feet and put his hands on his knees and breathed. Mabel was beside him in the same second. She didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that wasn't either obvious or inadequate. She put her hand on his back and felt him breathing, and she stood there while he coughed and breathed and coughed again, and she watched the bakery burn, and she kept her hand on his back. After a while, the coughing stopped. "Box is intact," he said. "I can see that." The floor held. Storage room took smoke damage, but the fire went through the east wall, not the floor. "All right?" He looked up at her. His face was dark with smoke. "You're not going to tell me I was right to go in." "You shouldn't have gone in." "I know." He looked at the iron box. "But I did." "Yes." She looked at him. "You did." They stayed like that for another moment, her hand on his back, his hands on his knees, the box between his feet, and the bakery burning itself out across the street in the storm. Vivienne appeared from across the road. She came slowly, with her arms still wrapped around herself and her face showing something Mabel had never seen from her sister in public, shame, or something close enough to it that the distance didn't matter. She stopped 6 feet away and looked at the iron box and then at her sister. Mabel looked back. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Vivienne said, "I'm sorry." And it came out with none of the social architecture she normally applied to statements, no calculation of how it would land or what it would accomplish. It was just the words. Mabel didn't respond immediately. She took her hand off Rhett's back and looked at her sister and thought about the kitchen at midnight and the crowbar and the lamp falling and the 4 days of work she had watched go to pieces on the bakery floor, and she thought about the railway committee letter and Gideon Falk and the 11 days Vivienne had held Silas Crow's card before using it. "I know," she said finally. It was not forgiveness. It was not its opposite. It was acknowledgement, which was all she had in her right now, and the most honest thing she could offer. Vivienne stood in the storm and nodded. Crow was found trying to leave Red Hollow at 4 in the morning. He was at the stable on the north end of Maine, saddling a horse he had not paid for, when the stable hand caught him and raised enough noise to bring 2 men from the street. Crow tried to talk his way out of it, which was a miscalculation, because both men had been part of the crowd watching the bakery burn, and neither of them was in the mood to listen to a deputy explain himself. They held him until morning. When the sheriff arrived, the county sheriff, not Crow, who was Crow's superior, and also, it emerged, Crow's source of accumulated grievances, he heard the account from the stable hand and the 2 men, and from Eli Morrow, who had seen Crow leaving the direction of Clement Street before the alarm had been raised. The sheriff was a methodical man named Arthur Dent, who had held the position for 12 years, and who had the particular investigative patience of someone who understood that the first story he heard was rarely the last one he needed. He interviewed Mabel first, at Rhett's ranch, where she and Vivienne had gone when it became clear neither of them had a building to sleep in. She sat at Rhett's kitchen table, a different kitchen, larger, with windows that let in the morning light, and told Dent what she had seen, what she had heard, and what she had found when she came down the stairs in the dark. She told it in the order it happened. She did not editorialize. She did not soften any part that involved her sister. Dent wrote it all down. Then he interviewed Rhett, who told him what he'd seen when he arrived and what Crow's behavior had suggested in the preceding weeks. Specifically, the attempt in November to gain access to the Calloway Ranch survey documents and 2 separate approaches about the southern boundary that Rhett had refused and reported to the sheriff's office at the time. Dent went to the county office and found both reports still on file, which confirmed timing and established Crow's pattern. Then he interviewed Vivienne. Mabel was not present for that interview.
She was told by Rhett, who was also not present, but who heard it from Dent afterward, that it had taken the better part of 2 hours and that Vivienne had, in the end, confirmed the substance of what Mabel had described. The meeting with Crow, the arrangement, the night of the fire, the moment when she had told Crow to stop, and he hadn't. She had also, Dent told Rhett,
produced the original survey notes she had given to Crow. Apparently she had retained a copy, and had submitted them to Dent with the specific statement that they had been used as part of an arrangement she now wished to dissolve. Crow was charged with arson, breaking and entry, and destruction of property. The charges went to the county prosecutor by the end of the week. What happened with Vivienne was more complicated, which was how most things involving Vivienne were. Mabel stayed at the ranch for 2 weeks. Rhett had offered it without framing it as charity, which was the only way she would have accepted it. He put her in the east guest room and Vivienne in the west, and told them both that they were welcome to use the kitchen and that he would stay out of their way when they needed him to. He did not entirely stay out of their way because he was a practical man, and the ranch required managing, and he and Mabel had established enough of an understanding by February that completely different orbits would have been artificial. She helped in the kitchen because she was constitutionally incapable of not helping in a kitchen, and he sat with her in the evenings sometimes, and they talked, and on the 3rd day he took her to see the section of the ranch where he'd been considering building an additional outbuilding. "Look at this space," he said. She looked at it. It was on the south side of the main house, with good sun exposure and proximity to the water line from the well. "What were you thinking?" she said. "I wasn't thinking anything specific yet." He looked at her sideways. "I was thinking I'd wait and see what someone with experience in commercial kitchen space thought about it." Mabel looked at the space for a long time. Then she looked at him. "That would require a stove vented through the south wall," she said, "and the water line would need to be extended 12 feet. I know. I'm not living at the ranch, Rhett. I'm not going to run a bakery out of someone else's property and call it mine." "I know that too." He turned to face her. "The building on Clement Street is still standing, the front room held. The east wall is gone and the kitchen is damaged, but the structure isn't condemned. Eli Morrow told me this morning the framing is sound." She looked at him. "I've already talked to a builder," he said. "I'm not asking your permission for that part because I don't need it. I can commission a damage assessment on any building in town. But the rebuild decision is yours. Everything about it is yours." "I don't have the capital to rebuild right now." She said it plainly. "The railway payment is intact. The spring contract may or may not hold. I have operating funds, but not construction funds." "I know." He met her eyes. "I'm proposing a loan. Documented, formal, with a repayment schedule and interest at the going rate. Not a gift. Not charity." He paused. "A loan from someone who has run his own operation long enough to know that good businesses need capital at the right moment." Mabel looked at the space on the south wall, at the angle of the light, at the water line running along the fence post. "I need to see the builder's assessment first," she said. "Of course. And I'll set the repayment terms. I'd expect nothing less. And if I decide the Clement Street location isn't viable and I need to find a different property, the loan still applies to that." He nodded. "Write it into the agreement." She looked at him for another moment. "You're very certain about this." "About the loan or about you?" "Either." "Yes," he said. "I am." She turned back to the south wall. The morning light was good. The ground was level. Someone who knew what they were doing could build something worth building on this kind of foundation. She wasn't ready to talk about what else he might mean by that, but she didn't pretend she hadn't heard it. The builder's assessment came back in 4 days. The Clement Street bakery was structurally repairable. The front room was intact. The kitchen required new flooring, new east wall framing, replacement of the oven unit and all its connections, and repair of the storage room door and interior shelving. The upper floor showed smoke damage, but no structural compromise. Total repair cost was within the range Rhett had discussed. Mabel read the assessment 3 times. Then she went to the land office to see Gideon Falk. "I'd like to discuss the purchase option in my lease," she said. Falk looked up from his desk. He already knew about the fire. Everyone in Red Hollow knew about the fire. He had the slightly careful expression of someone who wasn't sure which of the several conversations this might be. "The purchase option," he said. "Yes."
The landlord is Robert Hughes. He lives in Abilene. I want to contact him about purchasing the property before beginning repair, because I will not invest in rebuilding a structure I don't own. Falk looked at the lease file, which he had pulled when she walked in because he was, despite appearances, very good at his job. I can write to Hughes on your behalf, he said. Officially, as part of the land office's standard transaction facilitation. Do that, she said, and tell him the building sustained fire damage, and I am prepared to offer purchase at a value that reflects current condition, not pre-fire value. Falk wrote that down. He may want pre-fire value, he said. He's in Abilene, and I've been maintaining his building for 6 years. She stood. He won't. She was right as it happened. Hughes wrote back in 10 days with a figure that was fair. Not generous, but fair. And Mabel counteroffered once, and they settled on a number that left her the railway payment mostly intact and used the loan for construction. She signed the purchase agreement on a Thursday. She sat in Falk's office afterward with the signed document in front of her, and she let herself feel it for a moment, this specific, irreducible thing. The building was hers. The ground under it was hers. She had bought it with money she had earned and negotiated for it with her own argument and signed with her own name. She walked home, to the ranch, which was still home for the moment, and she told Rhett that the purchase had gone through, and he said good, in the way he said things that mattered to him but that he wasn't going to perform. She nodded. That evening she wrote to Aldous Pratt and informed him of the situation at Hart Bakery. The fire, the arson charges against Crow, the purchase of the building, and the reconstruction timeline, which she estimated would have the bakery operational 3 weeks before the spring contract delivery date. She wrote it the same way she wrote everything, plainly, factually, without apology. Pratt wrote back 4 days later confirming the spring contract was still in effect. She filed his letter in the new account ledger with the brass measuring weight sitting beside it on the ranch kitchen table. Vivienne left Red Hollow in the 3rd week of March. She announced it at dinner one evening, or as close to announced as Vivienne came, which was saying it in the middle of a conversation about something else, the way she had always delivered information she didn't want examined. I'm going to San Antonio, she said. I've arranged to stay with the Holloways for the season. Margaret Holloway was a friend of Mother's. Mabel looked up from the account ledger she was reviewing at the kitchen table. When? She said. End of the week. Vivienne looked at her plate. I've written to them already. They've agreed. A silence sat in the kitchen for a moment. Mabel thought about what to say. About Crow, whose case was with the county prosecutor and whose testimony would be required. About the arrangements that would need to be made. About 25 years of the particular domestic geography of 2 sisters in a house and what it meant for one of them to leave it. The prosecutor will want you available for the hearing, Mabel said. I know. I've spoken with Dent. I'll come back for it. A pause. He said I wasn't required to stay in the county until the date was set. No, you're not required. Mabel looked at her sister. San Antonio is better for you right now. Vivienne looked up. You're not going to fight me on this? No. I thought you'd be... She stopped. What? Angry. Vivienne said it quietly. Still. Mabel considered this. I'm angry, she said. That doesn't mean I think you need to stay in a town where everyone knows what happened. It doesn't mean I want you miserable. She looked back at the ledger. I also don't think you're equipped to stay in a place where you have to look at the consequences every morning. That's not a criticism. It's just true. Vivienne was quiet for a long time. I didn't know he was going to set the fire, she said. It was the 3rd time she had said it in 2 weeks, and each time it came out with slightly less of a defensive quality and slightly more of something raw. I know, Mabel said. I wanted to hurt the situation. I didn't want... She pressed her lips together. That's not an excuse. No, Mabel agreed. It isn't. Silence. The bakery will be better than it was, Mabel said, when it's done. The new oven is twice the capacity of the old one, and I'm putting the storage room on the other side of the kitchen where there's more space. She said it matter-of-factly. You'd be welcome there, when you're ready, if you're ready. Vivienne looked at her sister the way she had looked at her on the rooftop in November. Really looked, without the usual social apparatus. You're a harder person to damage than I understood, she said. I know. Mabel turned a page in the ledger. It's taken a long time to get that way. Vivienne left on Saturday morning. She came downstairs with a traveling bag and her good coat and stood in the hallway of Rhett's ranch house, where they had been living for 3 weeks, and she looked at Mabel standing at the bottom of the stairs, and she said, "All right." "All right," Mabel said. "I mean it." "I know you do." She handed her sister the parcel she had been holding, bread wrapped in cloth. "For the journey, it's 2 days on the stage." Vivienne took the bread. She looked at it. Then she left. Mabel stood at the door and watched the stage pull away from the main road, and she stayed at the door a little longer than necessary, and then she went back inside to the kitchen table and the account ledger and the list of things the builder needed her to confirm by Monday. She was not unchanged by any of it. The fire, the betrayal, the 3 weeks at the ranch, the purchase of the building. None of it had left her where she had been in January, which was fine, because where she had been in January had been built on an incomplete understanding of things she now understood better. What she was, on this Saturday morning in March, with the stage dust settling on the ranch road and the building on Clement Street being rebuilt board by board, was clear. Tired and clear and in possession of herself. Rhett found her at the kitchen table an hour later. He sat down across from her and looked at the ledger and at her face and said, "How are you?" Not how are you in the social sense, the actual question. She looked up. "Ask me in a month," she said. "When the bakery's open." He nodded. "I'll ask you then." "You'll be there anyway," she said. "Before 7? At the back door?" "Yes." He almost smiled. "I will." She looked at him for a moment. This man who had ridden through a storm and gone into a burning building and made a formal loan documentation and sat with her at a kitchen table on a Saturday morning and asked her the actual question, and she felt the specific gravity of the moment, its weight and its clarity. She was not ready yet to say all of it, but she picked up her pencil and went back to the ledger, and her hands were entirely steady. The builder's name was Carver Moss, and he was a deliberate man who said less than he knew and charged fairly, and showed up every morning before his crew did to walk the site alone. Mabel had selected him from 3 candidates by the simple method of asking each one what he would do differently than the previous construction, and Moss was the only one who had asked to see the original lease and the floor plan before answering. She trusted people who looked at documents before forming opinions. He began demolition of the damaged east wall the first week of March, and Mabel came to the site every afternoon without exception. She did not hover or redirect his decisions. She had hired him for his competence, and she respected it. But she walked the space at the end of each day and asked specific questions, and took notes in the new account ledger. And Moss, after the first week, began leaving her a daily summary on the work table they'd set up in the intact front room, which she found each afternoon and read before she did her walkthrough. It was a good working arrangement. She was still living at the ranch. The commute was manageable on the days Rhett let her take the smaller wagon, and on the days he needed both wagons, she rode the distance on the bay mare he'd assigned her use of without making it a discussion. The horse's name was apparently Fern, which Mabel found an unlikely name for a working animal, but kept this opinion to herself. The ranch was strange to live in, and then, gradually, less strange. She had her routine, the ledger work in the evenings, the afternoon site visits, the correspondence with Pratt about the spring contract timeline, and the new supplier she was establishing in Abilene, who had better quality control on the specialty flowers than the Red Hollow merchant. She fit these things into the ranch's existing rhythm rather than trying to reset it, and the ranch's rhythm, Rhett's rhythm, the particular orderliness of a man who ran a large operation competently, turned out to accommodate her without much friction. She noticed things about him she hadn't had room to notice before. He was up before her most mornings, which she would not have predicted. He made bad coffee and knew it, which was why he had been coming to the bakery before sunrise for 2 months before he told her. He had found good coffee, and he was not ashamed of seeking it out. He read in the evenings, mostly practical things, agricultural reports and land management texts, but occasionally other things she'd find left face down on the kitchen table. He fixed things without announcing he'd fix them, which was either good manners or an ingrained habit of independent action, probably both. He disagreed with her sometimes, about the builder's schedule, about the supplier in Abilene, about a decision she made in early March to take on a small private catering order when she was already at capacity. And when he disagreed, he said so directly and let her make the final call without sulking about it. She valued this more than she would have expected. She had not had a model for this kind of arrangement growing up. Her parents' marriage had been affectionate but asymmetric. Her father working, her mother managing the household. Two people in adjacent lanes rather than the same one. She had understood even as a child that this was the normal shape of things, and she had not, for most of her adult life, allowed herself to imagine a different shape, because different shapes were for women whose circumstances permitted them to want things beyond functional survival. Her circumstances were changing. She was figuring out what she wanted, carefully and without rushing, in the same way she approached every problem she took seriously. The Crow hearing was set for the second week of April. Dent sent notification to Vivienne in San Antonio, and she wrote back to Mabel directly, the first letter, which had arrived in late March on a day when the east wall framing was going up. And Mabel had flour on her coat, despite not having an operational kitchen yet, old habits being the kind that don't wait for appropriate conditions. The letter was 2 pages. The handwriting was Vivienne's, recognizable, slightly too elegant for the content, as though she couldn't quite let go of the presentation even in private correspondence. It covered the San Antonio arrangements, the Holloways, the weather, a minor social event she had attended. All of this in the first page and a half, which was the Vivienne approach to difficult letters, circling the real thing until the space ran out. The real thing was at the bottom of the second page, 7 lines. I have been thinking about what you said before I left, that I am not equipped to stay where I can see the consequences. You were right, but not only in the way you meant it. I have spent most of my life not seeing consequences because looking at them required admitting things I preferred not to admit. San Antonio does not fix this. I understand that. I am trying to understand what does. I will be there for the hearing. I will say everything truthfully. I owe you that and more. Mabel read it twice, folded it, and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, where it stayed for 3 days before she took it out and replied. She was not a natural letter writer. She wrote the reply 4 times before she got a version she could send. The final version was shorter than any of the drafts, which was usually how it worked. She told Vivienne about the east wall framing and the new oven unit that had arrived from the supplier in Dallas. She told her the spring contract was confirmed. She told her Fern was a reliable horse with an unreliable name. She told her that the hearing would be straightforward and that Dent was thorough, and that telling the truth was the only preparation necessary. She did not say, I forgive you, because it wasn't that clean and she wasn't going to pretend it was. She did say, at the end, come to the bakery when it opens. I'll have the coffee on. Well, Silas Crow did not make the hearing easy. He had acquired a lawyer somewhere between his arrest and April, a man named Pell from the county seat, who had the particular energy of someone being paid by the argument rather than the outcome. Pell challenged the chain of custody on the lamp evidence, challenged the stable hand's account of the timeline, and questioned whether the survey notes Vivienne had submitted were admissible, given that she was a party to the arrangement she was describing. Dent was ready for most of this. He had documented the physical evidence with unusual care for a frontier county, which Mabel later learned was because he had suspected Crow of a similar arrangement 2 years prior that he'd never been able to prove. And he had not made the same documentation mistakes this time. Mabel testified for 40 minutes. She sat in the county courthouse in her good navy dress, which had survived the fire because it had been in the closet upstairs. And she answered every question Pell asked her with the same directness she applied to everything, which frustrated lawyers of Pell's type, who preferred witnesses to either exaggerate or retreat. She did neither. She said what she saw and heard. She acknowledged the parts she had not directly witnessed. She did not add interpretation or emotion to the factual account, because she had learned that emotion in a courtroom is something opposing lawyers use, and she did not intend to give Pell any tools. When he asked her why she hadn't immediately suspected her sister's involvement when the Railway Committee letter arrived in February, she looked at him steadily and said, because suspecting a member of your family of deliberate harm requires sufficient evidence, and at that point I had a direction but not a confirmation. I acted on what I could document. Pell paused. That's quite a calculated response. I'm a calculated person, she said. The prosecutor, a younger woman named Aldine Hatch, who had ridden from the county seat and who Mabel took an immediate professional respect for, did not have many follow-up questions. She had done her preparation, which was visible in the precision of her case structure, and she did not need Mabel to perform anything beyond what she had already provided. Vivienne testified the following morning. Mabel was in the courtroom. She had not intended to be. She had thought she would wait outside, give her sister the room. But she arrived early to speak with Hatch about a documentation question, and by the time Vivienne took the witness seat, leaving seemed more conspicuous than staying, so she stayed. Vivienne had dressed carefully, not for effect, or not only for effect. She looked like someone who had decided that the way she presented herself for this particular hour was a form of respect she owed to the proceeding. She was composed in the way that people are composed when they have decided to be composed, rather than the way they are composed when things are easy. She answered Hatch's questions without hesitation, which Mabel would not have predicted 2 months ago. She described the meeting with Crow, the arrangement, the survey notes, the night of the fire, and her own instruction to Crow to stop, which Crow had ignored. She did not minimize her role. She did not perform remorse. She was factual, and the facts themselves were damning, and she did not try to dress them in anything softer. When Pell cross-examined her, he focused on her credibility as a witness, given her direct involvement. "You admit," he said, "that you entered into this arrangement deliberately." "Yes," Vivienne said, "and you're now testifying against the man you brought into it." "Yes." "Why should this court believe your account, given your demonstrated willingness to act against your own family's interests?" Vivienne looked at him. She was quiet for a moment, and Mabel, watching from the gallery, recognized the quality of that pause. It was the pause of someone choosing truth over performance, and it did not come naturally to her sister, and the effort of it was visible. "I don't know if you should believe me," Vivienne said. "What I can tell you is that I told him to stop and he didn't, and a building that has been in my family since I was born burned down with my sister inside it. What I did was wrong. What he did after I told him to stop is also wrong, and those are two separate wrongs, and I'm here to account for my part in the first one." The courtroom was quiet. Pell moved on. Crow was convicted on the arson and destruction of property charges. The breaking and entry conviction came in addition. Sentencing was set for 2 months out, and the sentence, when it came, was 5 years, which Hatch told Mabel afterward was on the higher end of what she'd expected. Vivienne's involvement was handled separately. Given her cooperation, her truthful testimony, and the fact that she had specifically instructed Crow to stop before the fire, the prosecutor did not file charges, but the court record reflected her role in the arrangement, and this was public, which in a town the size of Red Hollow was its own kind of consequence. She did not stay for sentencing. She went back to San Antonio the day after her testimony. Mabel walked her to the stage. They stood at the staging post in the early morning with 2 weeks of spring finally arriving in the temperature of the air, and Vivienne had her traveling bag and her good coat and the look of someone who is practicing, still, how to carry something they have not carried before. "The bakery opens in 3 weeks, Mabel said. "You said in your letter." "The coffee will actually be good this time. I have a proper grinder." Vivienne almost smiled. "I'll come," she said. When I've settled some things, I'll come." "I know you will," Mabel said. She handed her sister bread for the journey, the same way she had in March, and Vivienne took it and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at her sister and said, "You make me feel like I'm worth feeding, even now." Mabel looked at her. "You are," she said. "You've also made choices that had consequences. Both of those things are true, and they don't cancel each other out." Vivienne nodded. She got on the stage. Mabel watched it go and stood at the post until the dust settled, and then she turned and walked back toward Clement Street, where Carver Moss and his crew were starting their day. The bakery opened on a Tuesday in late April. It opened quietly, without ceremony, which was how Mabel preferred things that mattered to her. She unlocked the front door at 7 in the morning and turned the sign to open and went back behind the counter, and the first customer was Eli Morrow from the hardware shop next door, who bought a sourdough loaf and said the new east wall looked solid, and Mabel said it was, and that was the opening. By 9, the line was to the door. Dora was behind the counter, Petra was in the kitchen. The new oven was running at full capacity, and it was running clean and quiet in a way the old one never had, and the spring light came through the south window at an angle that Mabel had known since childhood, and that felt, this morning, like something continuous, a thread running from the beginning of her memory to this exact present, unbroken, despite everything that had tried to break it. She stood behind the counter and she worked. She did not think too hard about what the day meant. Thinking too hard about what a day means tends to get in the way of the day itself,
and she had learned this through long experience of days that had required everything she had. What she noticed was the weight of the new bread paddle was right. The sound of the oven, that particular low working sound, was right. The smell of the place at 7 in the morning, which had been the anchor of her life since she was 10 years old, was right in a way that had nothing to do with the new walls or the replaced shelving or the fresh paint on the east interior. The smell was the work, and the work was hers, and she was here. Rhett came at 10, not before 7, not at the back door in the dark. He came through the front door with the rest of Red Hollow, and he stood in line. There were 4 people ahead of him. And when he got to the counter, he looked at her across it in the way he looked at things he was paying full attention to. "It looks good," he said. "It is good. The east wall especially. Moss does good work." He looked at her. She looked back. The counter between them was the width of 2 feet in a long winter and everything that had happened since October, and neither of them said any of that because it was already in the room without being said. "Dark rye?" she said. "Please." She wrapped it herself, which she didn't do for most customers anymore, and she handed it across the counter and he paid, and their fingers were in approximately the same location on the parcel for a moment, and neither of them made anything of it out loud. He turned to go. "Rhett." He turned back. She looked at him for a moment with all the clarity she had, which was considerable and had been hard-won. "Come back tonight," she said. "After closing, I'll have coffee, the good kind." He held her gaze. "I'll be there," he said. He left. Dora, who had witnessed this exchange from 3 feet away while pretending to arrange the display shelf, said nothing at all, which was exactly the right response, and which confirmed for Mabel that she had hired correctly. The spring contract delivered without incident on the 14th of May. Mabel drove the wagon to the courthouse herself. Dora and Petra came with her, and they set up the delivery in the courthouse hall with the same systematic efficiency they had developed over the November railway job, and Aldous Pratt shook her hand again with the same recalibrated respect he had shown her the first time, except that there was no qualification in it now. "Exceptional work, Miss Hart," he said, and this time she believed he meant all of it. She said thank you and drove the wagon back to Clement Street. The circuit court sessions ran for 3 days, and every judge and clerk and lawyer who attended came into the bakery at some point during the week. One of them, a circuit judge named Harlan Cole, who ate his lunch at the counter because the hotel restaurant was full, asked if she had considered expanding her catering agreement to include the summer session at the district courthouse in the next county. She told him she would think about it. She did think about it. She thought about it seriously, with paper and pencil and a realistic assessment of what additional volume would require in equipment and staff in her own time. She talked it over with Rhett on a Thursday evening at the kitchen table in the bakery, which had become one of the places they talked things over, the ranch kitchen being the other. "You could do it," he said. "I know I could do it. The question is whether doing it is the right use of what I'm building here." "What do you want this to be?" He said it the way he said things he actually wanted to know. Mabel looked at the account ledger, at the figures for April, which were the best figures the bakery had ever produced, at the window and the street beyond it, quiet at 8 in the evening with the spring dark settling over Red Hollow. "I want it to be mine," she said, "completely and without qualification, not larger than I can manage without losing that, not so careful I don't grow." She tapped the ledger. "The district contract gives me geographic reach without requiring me to overextend here. I think it's worth exploring." "Then explore it." "I will." She looked at him. "What would it do to the loan repayment schedule?" "Nothing. The repayment schedule is the repayment schedule. Your business decisions don't affect it." "They might if I overextend and can't." "Mabel." He set down his coffee. "I'm not a bank. If something goes wrong, we work it out. That's how things work between people who trust each other." She looked at him for a moment. "Is that what we are?" "I think so." He met her eyes. "I think we've been that for a while, and you've been deciding how much to say about it." She had been. He was right, which she did not find surprising. He had a consistent record of being right about things she was in the middle of deciding. She looked at the ledger, at the window, at the coffee mug in her hand. "I'm not easy to be with," she said. "I've told you this." "You have. Multiple times. I mean it every time." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not uncomplicated either. I have a ranch that requires more of me than I sometimes account for, and I have my own habits that are fairly set, and I have..." I have my own version of the same thing you have, which is a long time spent not counting on much from other people. And that doesn't disappear because you decide to try something different." She looked at him. "We're both going to be difficult," he said. "That's not a reason not to try." Mabel set her coffee mug down. She thought about what it meant to try something when you had spent most of your life learning to want very little, to keep your expectations small and your plans practical, and your heart in a location that was defensible. She thought about Vivienne's letter and the harvest festival and the fire and the iron box and the morning on the courthouse steps when she had said yes to the spring contract and driven back to Clement Street with the cold air in her face and Rhett's nod from the platform steps at her back. She thought about the brass measuring weights on the kitchen rack, about the lease document in the iron box, about the account ledger with her name on the cover. She thought about what it meant to build something and who you built it with and how you knew when the foundation was right. "I need the loan converted to a formal legal document," she said. "Witnessed, filed at the land office. I won't have it informal." "Already done," he said. "Falk filed it in March." She looked at him. "You filed it without telling me." "I told you I would. You said write it into the agreement. I did." She considered this. "All right," she said. "I'll write to the document or I'll write to the rest of it." She looked at him across the kitchen table of the bakery she owned, the building she had bought with money she earned, on a street she had worked since she was 10 years old, in a town that had spent 25 years deciding she was the wrong kind of woman and had been, it turned out, entirely wrong about that. "Both," she said. He didn't move across the table or make anything dramatic of it. He nodded, in the way that meant he understood the weight of the word, and then he picked up his coffee, and she picked up hers, and they sat together in the quiet bakery with the spring night outside the window, which was not a perfect moment, because no moment actually is, but which was real and clear and fully inhabited by both of them, and that was better than perfect. That was, in fact, enough. But Rhett Calloway proposed on a morning in early June at the back door before 7. He knocked. She opened the door. He had the unhurried look he had brought to every early morning since October, and he had a ring in his coat pocket that he did not produce immediately because he was not a man who led with the object rather than the conversation. He said, "I've been thinking about the South Wall outbuilding." She said, "Rhett." He said, I want you there, not as a tenant and not as an arrangement, as the person who makes the decisions about that kitchen and who comes home to that house and who argues with me about oven temperatures and repayment schedules, and whether Fern is a suitable name for a working horse." She said, "It's not." He said, "I know. Marry me anyway." She looked at him in the morning light on the back step of her bakery, this man who had appeared at this door 8 months ago because he had seen her light from the road and smelled the bread, and who had sat at her kitchen table and asked real questions and listened to real answers and shown up for the bad Tuesday as readily as any other day, and she thought, "This is not the life I planned for. It is not the shape I would have drawn if someone had asked me 10 years ago what I wanted. It is better than anything I would have drawn." "Yes," she said. He brought out the ring. It was plain gold, not elaborate, which was correct. She let him put it on her finger. Her hands were calloused and flour-dusty, even first thing in the morning, which was not the condition in which most women in Red Hollow received proposals. And she did not apologize for it or try to hide it, because these hands were the reason she was still standing, and she had stopped hiding the evidence of what kept her upright. He held her hand for a moment without letting go. Then she said, "The coffee's on," and they went inside. They were married in September, in a ceremony that was simple by Red Hollow standards and entirely correct by Mabel's, which did not include elaborate decoration or a large guest list or anything that could be described as performance. Dora came. Petra came. Gideon Falk from the land office came because she had developed a genuine professional respect for him, and he had, over the course of several transactions, developed the same for her. Moss the builder came. Aldine Hatch came from the county seat, which surprised Mabel until she received the note that accompanied the acceptance, which said, "I attend weddings of people who testify well. You testify exceptionally." Vivienne came. She arrived the evening before, on the stage from San Antonio, and she was thinner than she had been in February and better in some way that Mabel couldn't precisely identify. Less arranged, perhaps, less maintained, more present to herself. They had dinner together at the ranch, the three of them, and the conversation covered practical things mostly. Vivienne's arrangements in San Antonio, a small position she had taken with a dressmaker there that she described without embarrassment and without over-explaining, and the district contract Mabel had signed in July for the summer courthouse sessions. They did not discuss the fire directly. They didn't need to. It was in the room the way old things are in rooms between people who have lived through them together, present without being spoken, acknowledged by the fact that everyone is still at the table. At the end of the evening, Vivienne said to Mabel, "I'm glad you're here. In your life, I mean. I'm glad you didn't let what I did take this from you." Mabel looked at her sister. "You didn't have that kind of power," she said. "Not cruelly, as fact." Vivienne thought about this. "No," she said. "I suppose I didn't." The wedding was in the morning, in the courthouse, because Mabel preferred functional spaces over ornamental ones. Rhett stood without fidgeting, which she appreciated. She wore the navy dress with the brass buttons, altered again for the occasion, because it was the best thing she owned, and because she was not going to buy a dress she would wear once when she had a perfectly good dress she had worn already. Afterward, they had a meal at the ranch with the people who had come, and there was bread she had made herself, which everyone agreed was the best bread they had eaten, which was also true. The Rhett Calloway Bakery. The name was Rhett's suggestion, and she'd accepted it after 2 days of consideration, opened its expanded operation in October, 1 year after the Harvest Festival, with a new storefront on Clement Street and a production kitchen 3 times the size of the original. Mabel stood behind the counter on the first morning in the same way she had stood behind the counter every morning for 7 years, present, alert, undecorated. She wore a deep green dress that Vivienne had sent from San Antonio with a note that said only, "You should have something that isn't navy." She wore it. She was not a transformed woman. This is the thing that matters most to say, and it is the thing that most stories get wrong. She was not rescued or revealed or made new. She was the same woman she had always been. The one who checked the floorboard and made the list and fixed the flue in a storm and drove the wagon herself and wrote the letter in 3 sentences without apology. What had changed was the size of the life around her, not the person inside it. Red Hollow lined up for her bread that morning, the same as they had always lined up, and she served them the same as she always had, efficiently and well. Some of them had been at the Harvest Festival. Some of them had seen Vivienne take the ribbon. Some of them had watched her dance with Rhett in the center of the square and formed opinions about what that meant. She did not need them to revise their opinions. She did not need their recognition, though she received it. She needed the door open at 7 and the oven running and the bread worth making. The rest had taken care of itself, which is not the same as saying it had been easy or that luck played no part or that wanting something hard guarantees you get it. It doesn't. The frontier was full of people who had wanted things hard and worked for them and lost anyway. And she knew that and had always known it. And she had built the walls and the floor and the roof of her life to be as solid as she could make them with the materials available, and she had done it alone until she didn't have to. Rhett came at 10, through the front door. He stood in line. She saw him when he came through the door, and she let him see that she saw him, and there was nothing hidden in it anymore, nothing managed or measured or kept carefully small. He came to the counter. "Dark rye?" she said. "Please," he said. She wrapped it, and he paid, and he did not immediately leave. "I'll be here at closing," he said. "I know," she said. He went. She turned to the next customer. The bread was good. The morning was good. The east wall of the bakery caught the early light the same way the original had before Silas Crow's crowbar, and the falling lamp, and the storm that had consumed one version of her life and left her, somehow, with the materials for a better one. She had not asked for any of it the way it came, but she had been ready for it, ready in the only way that actually counts, which is not the readiness of someone who has planned for every contingency, but the readiness of someone who has learned who they are under the worst conditions and decided to stay that way. The woman nobody chose had chosen herself first. Everything else, the man, the building, the ring on her calloused hand, had followed from that, the way good bread follows from honest ingredients and the right heat, and someone who knows what they're doing and refuses to pretend it's easier than it is. That was the whole of it. That was